Well, hello and welcome to the webinar. And here is Virginia Farley to welcome
Hi,
you.
everybody. Did I cut you off, Don?
Go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. This is Virginia Farley. I'm the Leadership Program Manager for the Stewardship Institute, and I run the Stewardship Leadership Roundtable, which many of you are familiar with and are members of. I wanted to welcome all the superintendents. This is open to all the superintendents and their staffs, and we have a very broad range of folks on the webinar today. I would say about half are superintendents and half come from a whole variety of different skill sets, jobs, and so it'd be very interesting to hear what's going on in your lives. The title of this webinar is Resilience, Tools to Thrive in Challenging Times, and we're being sponsored by we're sponsored by the Stewardship Institute of the National Park Service, and we're working with Don Maruska, who we've done a number of webinars with in the past. If you want to go to the next page, I'll start to introduce the team. Don is a master certified coach.
Go right ahead.
Okay, Don is a certified master coach and the author of 2 books on leadership development, talent development, and we've done webinars on both of those, including how to deal with tough issues, and maybe some of you participated in that, and then the talent development series that we did as well. We also have some guests today, special guests, 2 superintendents, Wendy Davis, or Wendy, from Keweenaw National Historical Park in Michigan, and Eric Leonard from Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. And I want to give them special thanks because they're both dealing with blizzards happening or on the way. I wasn't that clued in on just how big this thing is, so good luck with that, but we're really glad that they were able to work it out to be here. And they're going to be sharing their personal stories with you shortly. On the next slide, you'll begin to see all the different places that are represented in the webinar today. We have a record of 117 locations signed up, and in some of these cases, we may have 2 or more people on the call or on the webinar together. So that's a real record for us for the number of people attending a webinar, and I'm thrilled about it. And it also makes me realize that this topic is really it's really hitting home for a lot of people right now. So Don, you've gone through both lists, so you guys have got a sense of who's out there and all the different parks that are being represented today. So I'm going to just mention again that this is being recorded, and it will be available to other folks afterwards. We'll send it out to the superintendents again, and then for you to watch again or to share with other people. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Don.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you for all your work in organizing these webinars and other programs for the National Park Service. It's a real delight to be with you. I'm excited about the parks. I love your parks, and it's wonderful that you've been at this for over 100 years, not each of you, but the Park Service, helping to make our parks the wonderful places that they are. We're very interested in how many of you are participating at your each location. We know how many are logged in, but we're interested in how many folks are at that location. One of the things we've learned through these webinars is that if 2 or more people are present or participating from a park, even if you're at different locations, but within the park and participating, it really geometrically increases the learning and the experience of applying the insights to your daily activities. So we're very much encouraging groups, and so thankful. I'm seeing already we've got groups up to 10 in size that are participating from various locations, and that's really great. We'll be leaving the poll open for a minute here. So if We encourage interactivity with this session, and one of the ways we do that is through the questions that you type in. So type in the questions in the question function. I'll organize them and bring them up at appropriate points in time. It's also a way for you to ask questions anonymously. So, you can be candid about things that you're dealing with or whatever, and we'll address those appropriately on the webinar if it's really something very personal or particular to you only. That might not be applicable to others on the webinar. We'll deal with those offline. So let's take a look at our audience here and see what we have. So about 60% of you are there on your own in groups of varying sizes, and so up to 10 in size. That's really great. We're glad to have each and every one of you. And now we're going to be going over to launching the content of today's session. So this was a question that was asked of you at the time of registration, and I thought you'd like to see what the results look like. We had a lot of interest around the challenges that are being faced, kind of evenly between feeling discouraged, lacking resources, lacking a path. Some of the other topics that came up on this were disasters, workload, policies, bureaucracies, things that get in the way. And so what we want to do today is help you figure out, what are effective ways to be addressing these topics for yourself and to do that successfully. We're going to talk about really 3 broad categories of tools that are proven useful in dealing with this and illustrate them with the experiences of your colleagues. One is to manage your mindset. That is how you think about the situation. That's actually the biggest determinant of resilience, is our personal frame of mind. And we're going to talk with you about practical ways that you can manage your mindset in ways that are going to serve you effectively. How to multiply your resources. So if you're feeling resource constrained, as certainly we are with tight budgets and so on, what are things that you can make the most of what you have out of the resources that you've got? And then how you can make some big requests of other people to help get and accomplish what you'd like to be doing, especially in an environment where collaboration, partnerships, et cetera, are so important in this era of constrained budgets and challenging demands for the parks to be sustained and enhanced over time. So we're going to begin really with a story and perspective from Wendy Davis. And so Wendy's going to share with you something about her story, and we really appreciate you doing that, Wendy. That's great for you to be so candid with us and to share what you've experienced and what you've learned from that.
Thank you, Don. I think it's really important for particularly a superintendent to speak about things that have really challenged our resilience. There are a lot of assumptions about superintendents that we're pretty bulletproof, but we're just as soft and squishy as everybody else. I want to talk a little bit about the crisis that occurs when the optimism about the mission and the purpose of the National Park Service crashes into the reality that although the mission of our organization is one of lofty and seemingly moral values, the organization itself is a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies often do not run on moral values. So since this happens to me, I've mentored other people through it, or I've helped them at least bypass it or not feel the impact quite so strongly. It happened to me when I had been with the Park Service for about 15 years, and my career had run pretty smoothly from being temporary to having a term job to a permanent job and a variety of supervisors. I'd been able to work with all of them, and I felt like I was working towards a really good career outcome. But a change in the organization brought in a really series of destructive events, and it felt like the system that I had trusted and believed in all along had really turned against me and against my fellow team members. And we were not very successful in communicating to leaders in the unit where we worked what the problem really was. I did manage to get a directed transfer to another site, and in my experience, a directed transfer was a sign that you had failed big time and they were sending you away in shame to get rid of you. But it all happened very suddenly. And they really didn't have anything for me to do in that new location. And my skills as a change leader, as a creative person, or really any of my skills were not really needed at that organization, or that part of the organization at that time. So I was parked in an office, and the days dragged. And the organization that I had put all my trust and all of my being into, it felt like had just dumped me on the side of the road. So I looked at my awards and I thought about how hard I'd worked to get to this point and how all of it was over now, and so was my career, and I was not anywhere near old enough to retire, and I cried a lot. It actually took help from the Employee Assistance Program to get me back on my feet, and I really didn't understand for a long time how someone who spent her whole career as a change leader could be so blindsided by change. It really took me 2 years to get my feet under me enough to realize that I did have the resilience to go on and that I needed to apply for another job. So taking the insights that I took away from that, first of all, the first one has to do with boundaries. Being a person who works, not a worker who's a person in her spare time. I invested a lot in my job, and really I became my job. And as long as I now look at what I'm doing and keep a balance between what is Wendy and what is Wendy's job, at least one side of that generally is in a positive space, and that helps influence the other part of life. I also had to bring myself to the realization that government agencies don't have the same kind of values that people do. And that's okay, but it's something that we need to be particularly aware of, especially because most of us identify strongly with the mission of the National Park Service and the values that we perceive in that mission and how they match with our own values. The bureaucracy is going to be different than any one person. I think, too, keeping a positive outlook is something that I took for granted. I always had a positive outlook. I was a happy little person going along, and I lost it for a bit, and I didn't know how to get that back. I had taken it for granted, and now that I have intentionally nurtured that positive attitude, I have some tools for getting it back when I'm in a hole that I didn't have before. So keeping that positive outlook is important. And the big insight for me on both sides of that boundary between life and work is the realization that you can use a lot of different metaphors for it, but for me it's a series of deaths and rebirths. I can't avoid them. It's a natural cycle, but I can control how I respond to them, and I can control how I choose to work through them. And there's always the chance that I can rebuild myself, reform a little bit as a worker on the other side when change happens that knocks me off my feet, rather than dissolving in a pool of tears, although I might still cry a little. So now that I'm through that, I have developed a series of tools that I didn't even realize I had until I was sitting down looking at this story and this webinar, tools for maintaining that resilience. First of all, I really do set positively phrased goals. Even a small goal is a goal, and when I was sitting in that office without a real defined job for a while, survive the day was a goal. It wasn't real great goal, but it was a goal. I said and I wrote positive statements, and I thought it was the nuttiest thing that someone could ask me to do would be to sit down and write, I'm going to go for a walk and see 2 beautiful things, and I'm going to come back and write down what those are and journal that out. I thought, this is ridiculous. It's not going to help, but boy, did it help. so setting just even small, positively phrased goals when things are spinning out of control is important. I also decided that if I'm going to have a plan, I'm going to hold it lightly. I'm going to hold it in open hands so that if I need to let go of a piece of it or the whole plan, I can do that. If my hands are closed tight, I'm not able to grasp anything new and something might slip through my fingers. So I try to hold things very lightly. That helps me to be a learner. It helps me to indulge in new things that may have not been part of the original plan, but they're things that help me to be more myself. And they're not always work. It's not always work learning. Sometimes it's just something I want to learn just because I want to learn it. It's indulgent and it's wonderful. And part of learning is being able to risk. And so risking regularly, taking small risks, letting go of the side of the pool and finding out what it's like out there in the deep end, are ways to learn more. When there's a philosophy of failing forward that basically says every time we fail, we learn something valuable that we didn't know before. And I think taking small risks and learning from them is really helping me maintain that sort of ninja resilience that's necessary for the times that we're in right now.
I'm wondering, Wendy, if you might share with our audience an example of a small risk, so that they could have some context of that, because risk could mean any variety of things to people, and if you gave them an illustration, it would be more concrete.
I think one that we're kicking around at the park right now as a way for all of us to take a risk together is to create a temporary wayside exhibit that just basically has some placeholder text in it that we think might work, to interpret a space where we might want to tell people more information, we might want to share with them what they're seeing. We don't know how that will be received, and we want to just take a really inexpensive wooden frame and put it out there and see what happens to it, see what the response is to it. I think personally, the kinds of risks, one of the risks that maybe for some people would be a big risk, for me, I auditioned for a musical, something I hadn't done since I was in college. And taking that risk, and you could audition and someone could tell you no. It would be horrible. What rejection? But it was actually fun, and they didn't say no, so it was fun.
So risk taking is a little bit like a muscle. You need to exercise it, and you can exercise it in your personal life, and it'll make you stronger in your work life, and you can take some risks in your work life, and it'll make you stronger and more resilient in your personal life.
Exactly. Because if you get used to kind of bobbing and weaving with some recreational risk, when the real situations come along where you have to bob and weave, you already have those muscles built. You already have that ability to flex in place.
You've got those sea legs to manage.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for sharing that concrete example.
Yeah. I think too, something that's very hard for us in the Park Service, because we like to tell each other scary stories, is keeping fear in perspective. Most of the crises that we face on a day-to-day basis are not life and death. We can choose. I see my note here that I can choose to let my lizard brain, my amygdala, tell me that I'm in a fight or flight situation, but that's not going to help me to get through the situation and move on to the next day or the next crisis point even. And so saying to myself, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen here? I put this report in a day late, or I miss out on this opportunity and take advantage of another one. Nobody's going to die. So for the most part, so it's keeping fear in perspective is extremely important. And part of that is asking, when I feel myself becoming resilient or resistant and brittle, and I can see that it's my way or the highway and I'm resistant to change, I ask myself, which one of my assumptions about the world is being challenged? Where is this hitting in my sense of comfort with myself and with what it is I'm supposed to be doing at work, and my value system? And sometimes if I can put a finger on it and say, okay, this is because I really feel this runs contrary to my belief that everything should be fair, and this situation is inherently unfair, then I can bob or weave. I can put that ninja persona back on again and be a little more flexible when I feel myself otherwise bracing against change. I also think getting help is important. I think sometimes we hesitate to get help because we feel like that's a weakness, and it isn't. It's really a strength to be able to ask for help and to accept help, and to get used to accepting help and asking for help is one of those muscles that we should all build. So whether that comes from a coach or from a colleague, or sometimes that employee assistance program person can listen to what you have to say. And unlike your colleagues who might say, oh yes, the end of the world is coming, this is horrible, the Park Service as we know it is over, and everything is going to be miserable from now on, might be able to give you, a different perspective that's more positive and can be more helpful and challenge you to think deeply. I think the biggest thing is that you can always learn more about being resilient. And that's why I was looking forward to this particular webinar, because I think the minute that I think I've got it all together, one of those winds of change comes from a new direction, and I need to use the skills all over again. So I'm looking forward to this, Don.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. And thank you for your candor. I think that really is so helpful to our audience in helping them to open up and think about their own circumstances. And what I want to do next is to really talk with you all about, you've listened to Wendy's story, and some of you may say, okay, well, that's easy for Wendy to do, but I don't see how I would do that myself. And so what I've done is I've put together some tools that you can apply yourself in whatever circumstance you're in, to put the concepts and experiences that Wendy's highlighting into a framework that can work for you. So let's take a look at those. In terms of managing your mindset, which is the key thing that I think Wendy was really talking with you about, there's three components that we're going to talk about. One is to check your assumptions to clarify your understanding of the situation. Many times our brains work to catastrophize the circumstances. Something arises and we think, oh, that is, like Wendy was saying, the end of whatever. And it's important to be able to figure out how to check those assumptions. Secondly is to choose a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. We'll talk about what those are and why that's important, and what the research shows about how that makes a difference for you in practical terms. And then how you can harness your hopes to tap your best brain and inspire others and to move forward. So those are three things we're going to take a look at here. And then we'll be moving on a little bit to Leonard's experiences and a different set of tools that will arise from that. But one of the things about checking your assumptions is very important to note is just how quickly our minds act to be self-protective. That's what we're wired for. We're wired for the tiger coming at us, and we kill it or we run away. But that's not the environment that we live in today's times, at least not in most circumstances. And instead, we have this sort of cascade. Something happens, we interpret it, fears launch our defenses, and we catastrophize. And unless we intervene and we manage how we react to the circumstances, and even how we think about it, and even what we say to one another about it, we will be off to the races on, as Wendy was describing, our lizard brain. And let me show you that. The fears that launch these defenses, this is a positron emission tomography scan of a brain when someone is fearful. And you're seeing the amygdala here. That's this red area. at the base of the brain. It's called the lizard brain because it's the ancient part of the brain as we have evolved. And that's red because that's highly energized and firing off and shooting the adrenaline and everything else that happens that gets us all riled up. What's interesting is the prefrontal cortex and the cerebral lobes of the brain that are in the purple and blue here. The purple and blue indicates that those are deactivated areas of the brain. The brain is essentially shut down because it's sending all of its energy to that fight or flight defensive response. So just at the time when we need our best thinking with the challenges that we face on organizationally or in our teams, et cetera, things that we need to think through, our brains really get hijacked. And as a result, we tend to catastrophize about the situation. We tend to lose focus. We tend to lose a frame of mind. So the question becomes, since this occurs so rapidly, you have only really a fraction of a second to turn this cascade around and to make it come out differently. So I want to talk with you about a couple ways that are critical to dealing with that. One is, if there's something you can do to stop that cascade, to give yourself a moment before you interpret it in a way that launches fear and catastrophizes, you have a great opportunity to be in control of yourself versus being hijacked, if you will. So what's the way of doing that? I think the most powerful tool that you can think about is reflective listening. That is, when somebody says something to you like, oh, we're not going to be able to launch that new project we've all worked on for months here at our park. Well, and then that might send a whole cascade of concerns through your mind. But the first thing to do is to reflect back what you heard is, okay, you're telling me that something's arising that we may not be able to carry forward with our plans for that critical project. That gives the person who said that to you a chance to say, was that really what they were intending to communicate to you? Or was that just how they happened to phrase it, or just how we happened to hear it? Either of which could be out of sync. And they might say, "Oh, no, what I really mean to say is that we've got some hurdles we got to cover, and the way we were proceeding, we just can't go forward with." So you see, you've had a chance to ask a question, to clarify what's happening, to give your mind a chance to take in, make sure you're hearing accurately, make sure the person's intended communication has been received appropriately. Sometimes people say, "Oh, yeah, I didn't mean to say that at all. I was just, thinking that we've got some challenges here." So it's a great way to be effective in doing that. All you need to do is just say, "Okay, I'm going to be a mirror for a moment." A mirror reflects back what happens. Whereas if we're a sponge, the sponge absorbs it, and we really get overwhelmed by that otherwise. So think of reflective listening as a great skill. There's some tools about that. If you go to takechargeofyourtalent.com/NPS from our past work together on Take Charge of Your Talent, and some of the tools there about how to do reflective listening, is a great way for you to be controlling the situation. So what I'd like you to do, because this is a practical webinar, this isn't just to hear stories, wonderful stories like Wendy's, which is great to hear, but what are you going to do with this? So you might ask yourself, what's a situation or assumption that you want to understand better, and where could you use some reflective listening? Maybe do a quick check on yourself. What's something that's really, nagging at you? Maybe somebody said something, maybe there's a communication that happened, maybe there's a situation brewing. But what could you do to use reflective listening to check back and to see if you're really dealing with the immediate circumstance or with something that's quite different than what you think? The next item here is this growth versus fixed mindset. There's a wonderful book about mindset by Carol Dweck, a researcher out of Stanford. And she essentially posits two ways in which people tend to approach things. One is a fixed mindset. It is what it is, and the situation can't change. And people who take that mindset actually have very different, even if they're highly qualified people, if they have that fixed mindset, they tend not to be as successful or as satisfied in the work that they do if they take that approach. If they instead have a growth mindset, which is life is a work in progress, let's explore, which is I think what Wendy's story was really helping us understand, there's a great opportunity for us to be much more effective in the situation. So I encourage you to think about that. Think about, what is your mindset? Where are you? Are you feeling stuck? And if you are, then maybe lightening up, doing some of the things that Wendy was sharing with you to hold things less tightly, so they can grow, they can change, they can morph, and having that learner's mind, beginner's mind, as some people call it, is a great way to put less pressure on yourself and actually to get better results as a result of that whole effort. And if you've got kids who are going through school, you'll want to read Carol Dweck's book about mindset, because it's really critical on how they're going to absorb or not absorb their learning and what can go forward over time. So these are things that you can practice at work for home, or at work for at home for work. It goes back and forth, and that's, I think, the great value. The third thing is to harness your hopes. So if we look at this cascade, there's a very different cascade that happens when we have a hopeful frame of mind. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this. There's happiness projects at both Stanford and another one at Harvard, interestingly. Both coasts are working on this. And it really is coming up that, and essentially this was, again, something that Wendy's story highlighted, I think, very, very nicely, which is if you start the day with a sense of gratitude for what is, it's very powerful. In fact, there's a very good exercise that you can do. I try to do it as best I can every day. I journal in a book, and I start off because I know the research tells me it's useful, just as Wendy saw creating positive goals was useful, even though kind of resistant, you think, oh, that's silly. But actually, we can train our minds on how they function. And how they go for us, just like we can train our muscles. The brain is actually, a pretty big muscle. And, that is start off, write down 3 things that you're grateful for. Even if, it's feeling like, hey, things are going to hell in a handbasket of the park or whatever, probably 3 things that you really feel grateful for. The great sunrise there. There was a great, wonderfully thankful people that were coming through. Any of a variety of things, but figure out, what at least 3 things that you're grateful for. That gets you into a more hopeful frame of mind, because what happens when you're in a hopeful frame of mind, here's what the brain functions like in that frame of mind. You'll see the amygdala there is in green. That means it's neither highly activated nor deactivated. It's just, functioning. And what's red here, with a high levels of metabolism happening, that means where the brain is really functioning actively, is in the prefrontal cortex and the cerebral lobes. And those are the creative parts of our brain, the parts that help us indeed see opportunities. So this all really plays to your strength. And then when you see opportunities, that attracts others that want to partner with you. Because, when we're hopeful, when we see opportunities, we tend to attract people. When we're sort of Debbie Downer, we tend to they tend to push away, because like, oh, I don't want to go there. That sounds like that's a needy person that's going to be just a problem. So there are very practical things that you can do, and I hope that, and really it's something that you can do with your team. And ask them about something when it comes up. Well, what are your hopes about this project, or about what we're working on, or about your career? What are your aspirations for this? Why are they important to you? And try to dig a little deeper. When people get to a foundational level in themselves of what's motivating them, it's very, very powerful. And you can be a generous listener, asking these best brain questions that will help you be effective in doing that. And you can see more information about that in the book or in the materials that are available for the National Park Service on the website. There are all kinds of ways you can go about making this real for yourself. So what I'd like to do now is really we want to see how you're bouncing off of these ideas and have a polling question here. How would you like to manage your mindset? Which of these things that you've heard, just have a small sampling here of the things that Wendy was sharing with you and that I've shared with you, but click off as many as you think would be helpful to you in having a mindset that's going to enable you to be resilient. It's not trying to change what you're thinking, it's trying to change how you think, so that you can be more able to respond to circumstances as they arise. And again, if you have a situation that you'd like to offer or ask a question about, or you've something that Wendy said or that I've said thus far that is raising an issue in your mind, or you're we've been unclear about, please type a question in the question function. It'll be anonymous to our audience here, and we'll be glad to answer them. So let's take a look at where this comes out. So we can see from the results, a lot of people are resonating with embracing a hopeful growth mindset, which is great. You know, keeping the fears in perspective, which Wendy certainly was encouraging people to do. Hold the plans lightly, also got a lot of attention, a little bit less than the others, and getting help from others is very useful. And that help, you know, you can be of help to each other as a colleague. One of the things that we found, and I want to come back to something that Wendy mentioned here a moment ago, which was very important, which is, you know, how, Wendy, you found it was so much more helpful, you know, when you talked with the EAP person versus a colleague who was just kind of like catastrophizing with you, and you were reinforcing each other's, you know, doomsday scenario. And I think, you know, that's really an important thing, because there's a certain tendency for us to catastrophize because the stories are more exciting, you know, when they could be have these dramatic, disastrous outcomes. But they get us stuck in that in a mindset that isn't going to help us, and we actually become sort of complicit with each other in or codependent, if you will, on a negative framework. I'm wondering here on this one, since it didn't get quite as much of a response from people on hold plans lightly and open hands, can you give an example about that one? Something concrete that would give people a sense of how you've held a plan lightly with open hands and how that helped you flex when it happened?
I think just as I was moving out of the fixed mindset that my career was over and I was stuck here now forever in this office, saying, okay, so this is what I thought was going to happen, and it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that it was that my career was over. What it meant was I had to open up, take off the blinders, open up my mindset, and say, okay, what else could I be doing? Is it in the National Park Service? Are there other experiences that I could apply myself to? I have a skill set. What other jobs could I do with that skill set? And ultimately, and strangely, because it was never a career goal, here I am as a superintendent, which is extremely rewarding. So, you know, but it wasn't part of that original plan at all. So I wouldn't be here if I hadn't let go of the plan. I'd be somewhere else catastrophizing.
So it's not only holding the plans lightly so that when they're frustrated, you don't you don't go down with the plan that got shot, but also that in having that openness, it actually opened you to something even bigger and better than you had originally planned. So that kind of flexibility gives you, and that resilience enables you to see things, see opportunities.
Right. It also helps me recognize things that I can't change that are outside my scope of influence. And I can just hold those things and say, okay, I don't fully understand this. I don't have control over this, but I realize it as part of my reality. And so I'm going to sit here with it peacefully and work through it rather than freaking out about it and locking down my resources. Because once I've set course and locked all the resources down and I'm prepared for launch, there's only one way to go is, launch or throw the plan out. So.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. So, speaking of launches, we're going to go now to Eric Leonard, who is indeed in the role of interpreting launches and how to do that. And so, Eric, we're so delighted that we have you here with us today, and look forward to your sharing your story about how you've been accomplishing amazing things there with limited resources, and what that can tell us about how to be resilient.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here and watch the snow through the windows in western South Dakota. The park is closed today, and so as we were preparing the presentation, we spoke about what does that mean for resilience. The next month will make 24 years since my first season as a interpretive park ranger at Fort Larned National Historic Site in western Kansas, and thinking about that breadth of time, and now I'm on my 9th park in as I've moved through my career and experienced different places. One of the things I tell people who don't work for the National Park Service is, first, employees in the National Park Service often have dramatically different relationships with the place that they work in than visitors do. And then, second, never ever doubt the capacity of your park to remind you how little you actually know. These places can teach us a great deal. And in the course of my career, as I look backward now, many of the parks I've worked at, not all, but many, were sites that preserve stories of violence and controversy, and interpreting those stories prepares a park ranger to kind of be ready for anything. And then my position prior to becoming superintendent at Minuteman Missile 4 years ago, for 4.5 years, I was the Chief of Interpretation at Andersonville National Historic Site and National Cemetery in South Georgia. And Andersonville is noteworthy because out of the 14 national cemeteries administered by the National Park Service, in 2019, it remains now the only one still open for new burials. And when I worked there, my staff and I participated in the process that led to the burial of about 170 modern veterans or their spouses or family annually. And that's not for everyone. You're dealing with a kind of visitor who is often coming to you from a place of grief, or you're talking to veterans or widows who they're planning the end of their lives, and that sort of perpetual rest that a national cemetery provides. And those conversations and that environment has a way of really readjusting how you prioritize things in a crisis. And I really benefited by working there, and I'm grateful for that experience. I think it's important to note that every park always is experiencing some kind of operational change. Minuteman Missile in the past 4 years is perhaps a little bit more distilled a atmosphere of constant change. When I arrived just over 4 years ago, the park had completed and just moved into a visitor center, after a dozen years in trailers. Since that time, we've also completed, exhibits, films, infrastructure at the missile silo itself, the Launch Control Center, to accommodate visitors, because for some funny reason, the United States Air Force wasn't really interested in people being able to easily drive up and park at any of these places when they were operational. In the midst of that, we've implemented a tour fee, raised that same tour fee. We're building the final piece of infrastructure that was envisioned in the Parks General Management Plan 10 years ago, and we're a permanent staff of 5 people, and in 4 years, turnover's been high. 4 of my staff have moved on or moved up to other positions, and in the midst of all that, when you build a park right off of 3 exits on Interstate 90 in western South Dakota on the way from Badlands to Mount Rushmore, people stop, and visitation has increased by about 230%. And so every time we think we're sort of, well, that's done, we don't have time to enjoy it, you move on to the very next project. And so this Herbert Hoover quote has been something that's been in my mind and on my mind, constantly in the past 4 years. And so in the midst of this, I have a couple of sort of tips or strategies that I've used to keep us moving forward, to maintain a momentum, and just how do you when the winds are going to blow, and in western South Dakota on the northern Great Plains, they blow all the time. How do you protect your staff from just becoming weary of constant change? And so I've got a couple of strategies that I've used. And that first is define what the goals are, what the shared goals of the park are. What are we working on? What will that lead to? And that's critically important, because as construction equipment comes into a parking lot in the middle of a summer, that was my first summer here, you have to have your staff who work the front desk, who clean the bathrooms, be able to tell visitors why they had to park further away from the building. In an atmosphere of constant change, the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is your institutional memory. Respect it, learn from it, but don't be beholden or trapped by it. And Minuteman Missile is a fairly new park that we've been operating and open to the public for about 15 years now. And in that time, how the park has managed tours into our prestige cultural resource has shifted a lot. And I'm fortunate that there's records from about 10 years ago. They were doing open house format tours into what is charitably one of the strangest historic house museums in the national park system, because its basement is really bizarre. And it was that basement, which is an underground launch control center, was meant for 2 Air Force officers. That's it. So the elevator, is a 3x5 lift car that we put a park ranger and 6 adults in. It's a tight space. That elevator, amazing piece of equipment. It's an Otis elevator lift. It was installed in 1962. When I arrived at the park, it was seen as a threat. It was seen as dangerous, because during these open house periods, in the space of 3 hours, the staff would run 300 visitors through, and up and down into that control center, and they'd run the elevator about 50 times. And so the switchgear was melting. And having that knowledge and being able to say, this is why we need to be very careful at how we maintain staff in and out of the building, that was very helpful for me to have in my back pocket as we defend our operation. And as projects change, and they always do, communicate that status, update everyone, regardless of what they do in the park, about what's happening and why. Why is there a delay? And for us at Minuteman Missile, the park film took over 3 years to finish, and there was a lot of anticipation on that project, and it became really frustrating and for everyone involved. But you also want to celebrate successes. And even the small ones, we when our exhibits took 2 years, a year longer than expected, and so when we had an initial, what we'd hoped to be a grand opening, well, we debuted a part of the exhibits that was finished, but not everything, and that allowed both the staff and the public to see that progress was being made, and sort of then an opportunity to say, okay, we've done this, what's next? Be open about changes beyond your control. It sounds funny, but talking about the contracting process to your custodians, your front desk staff is important, because sometimes that's where things get hung up, and even superintendents might be all powerful, but no, sometimes contracting is more powerful. And then solicit input on outcomes and processes. When that park film was finally finished and we started showing it to the public, we set it up in the summer. It runs on a schedule. Well, in the course of 6 weeks, we changed that schedule 3 times before we landed on something that everyone was happy with. And empowering the GS4 seasonal to say, I don't like that, that's too long to wait, is useful, and everyone's happy with how that works now. And then finally, be present in those moments. Interact with staff, interact with those contractors, because that's often how you understand that something might not be wrong yet, but someone's upset, or there's a challenge you hadn't anticipated, and being in that moment can be exhausting, but it's really, really exciting. And once this blizzard's done, and in 6 more weeks, we're going to have a maintenance building for the first time in the park's history, a permanent home for staff that have literally been storing equipment either out in the prairie or in containers for 5 or 6 years. That we're going to celebrate that success, and then move on to the next project.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Eric. A wonderful story of the successes that you've accomplished in highly constrained resource times. One of the things that struck me about your resilience is how you create resilience for yourself. Instead of kind of positioning yourself as the all-knowing superintendent, you're empowering that GS4 and others to give you input and to flex with circumstances, so that you don't feel like you're there white knuckle on the skis, trying to force something to happen that just isn't occurring with the slopes and conditions that you're facing.
Yeah, well, we're never really successful by ourselves. The group is successful together, and that embracing that and in such a small little staff has been very key to keeping everybody on the same page. Great.
So you'll recall that I mentioned at the outset that we were highlighting several different areas. One, manage a positive manager mindset. The second one is to multiply your resources. So we're going to use Eric's circumstances and illustration of how to do that. There are 3 ways to multiply your resources. One is become more aware of the resources that you actually have. Our minds tend to always focus on what we don't have, not what we do have. So you start with that, and then boost the use of the resources that you've got, and then do something that they do very effectively in Silicon Valley, which is now being exported out in a lot of other service industries like yours and others, which is mashups, and we'll talk a little bit what those are like and how to do them. So we'll go through each of these, and on several of them we'll be picking up and asking Eric about his take on applying these in his circumstances. So the first one here is to list the resources you have. A very interesting thing that my co-author Jay Perry and I found in doing the research for Take Charge of Your Talent is that if you ask somebody to write down all the resources they have that could help them on a particular project, and if they keep that going and really challenge themselves and challenge others to help them see resources they're maybe not even aware of themselves, that by the time they get to a list of 100, that's why it's called the 100 Resource Challenge, they will discover how resourceful they indeed are, and often, in the vast majority of cases, will have solved or accomplished their objective just by becoming more aware of the resources they've got. Part of that is to be active in doing more with what you have. If you actually go through this exercise, and you can download a free participant guide at takechargeofyourtalent.com/NPS. That's your page for the National Park Service. Everything there is free for you. You can actually see this exercise, and you can do it for yourself. Write down your resources, figure out, well, how much of each of them are you using? Oftentimes the percentages are quite low. And then what are some actions you could take to use more of that? In some cases, it might be simply asking somebody if you could do something more with them. That's a very effective way to go. So encourage you to take a look at that and how you can do it. One of the things that's also very powerful is these mashups. So a mashup is where you take different resources that you've already got and you put them together in a new way. So in Silicon Valley, for example, they don't write software code from scratch for a new product. They take applications from other things that are similar, and they mash them up and put them together. That makes their work a lot faster, and they can come up with new solutions as a result. So I'm wondering, Eric, if we might just play with this for a moment with Minuteman Missile Site here. Could you give an example of a mashup, where you took some resources that you had, either within your own control or with partners, and you put them together in a new and different way that enables you to be resilient and to deliver something for your park?
Well, in a park about a secret weapon, we have a number of secret weapons we can draw on. We're fortunate that our visitor center and headquarters is just 9 miles from the visitor center and headquarters for Badlands National Park, and that's not entirely a coincidence. That's a much larger park with a much larger resource pool, and we're thinking about blizzards today. A month ago when we did this the last time, to get the visitor center so that we could walk to it safely and park our cars safely, we drew on resources that Badlands had, and so mashed up both the people and resources of that we had, and then we knew we had this additional pool of equipment that we could draw on as needed, and that allowed us to break 5-foot drifts and clear out the sidewalks by the end of the day.
Great. Yeah, and of course, with 400 parks, there's probably other places where other parks where people can collaborate with nearby resources and folks to be doing things. So thanks for that illustration. Of course, one of the things that's critical in getting access to resources that you don't control yourself. In fact, it's interesting. One of the definitions in the Harvard Business Review of an entrepreneur, and some people like to think of themselves as entrepreneurs in the National Park Service because you're operating and you're trying to make new things happen and in creative ways. So you are a social entrepreneur. But define an entrepreneur as somebody who proceeds to accomplish results without constraint by the amount of resources they currently control, because entrepreneurs start off with next to nothing and they try to create something from it. So one of the big challenges is to figure out how to make requests of other people and how to do that effectively. And this is a formula that I found has worked. I use this with CEOs that are trying to figure out how to be more successful in their business transactions or in their relationships with their employees. I use this in academic institutions and in not-for-profits, etc. They've all found it useful. So let me explain a little bit. It's 4 parts: intention, observation, request, and confirmation. And we're going to turn to Eric in a moment and ask him if he can think of an example of applying this or a situation where he might apply it and something that's coming up. This is a real live time show here that we're doing, not canned. But the first piece is to create an intention that attracts other people. Oftentimes, by the time we ask somebody for something, we're so frustrated that we don't have it or whatever that we just say, this is what I need. Well, that doesn't create anything there for the other person. So you want to create an intention that attracts the other party, and that has something in it that appeals to them, to want to help and support you in that effort. So you phrase the intention in that way. The second is, just provide a matter-of-fact observation of a situation, especially if you're trying to get something from somebody that hasn't provided it to you thus far. If you say, well, you haven't gotten me that result, and I've been waiting for it, and I'm frustrated, and you make a judgment on the other person, that makes them resistant to want to give you something, because then they'll want to get in the whole defenses of why they didn't do it and whatever else happened, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to be very matter-of-fact, like a scientist would record in their lab book. I made a request at such date, and this is now, whatever days passed, and haven't yet received a response. Wanted to find out what's happening here. So there's a variety of things you can do to be observational in a way that encourages people to hear what you have to say, so that little lizard brain of theirs doesn't key off on I'm being judged, I'm being challenged, or whatever else. And then you just present a very clear request, a very short one. You go quiet and let the other person respond. And then, very importantly, you confirm, because somebody might say, oh, yeah, sure, I'll do that for you. I'm sorry, I just didn't get to it. And then you go away, and then you think, okay, they're going to step right to it, and they might leave the session thinking, I'll put it on my list. Remember, I've got it, and I'll be sure to finish it, next week. So you can have a disconnect there. So I'm wondering, you've accomplished a lot of things. You've made a lot of requests of other people. Do you have a thought here, Eric, that you might share with us about how you could apply this request on something coming up for you, or something that's just recently happened?
Well, about 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to meet the director of the State Museum in the state capital here in South Dakota, it's spelled Pierre, it's pronounced Pierre. That's your South Dakota tip for the day. And
thank you.
They have a really beautiful facility with a temporary exhibit gallery that's as big as the public part of my visitor center. And what I have is really crazy missile artifacts with no place to display them. And in the course of getting to know Jay, I made that request of, you have space, I have stuff. Wouldn't it be cool if we did a museum exhibit together, a temporary exhibit? And it's taken 3 years. That exhibit will open the end of next month. And so, we've been confirming with staff, now we were supposed to deliver artifacts to Pierre Wednesday, but the blizzard has pushed that, a little bit to next week.
Okay. So what do you think was pivotal in getting his support for your request?
Some of it was just the personal relationship, and I'd involved him in something else we were doing, one of those other projects of the past 4 years. When we sat down to do the Parks Foundation document, because I knew Jay and was getting to know him, having a museum professional in the room that didn't know anything about how the Park Service worked, but knew how museums were supposed to work and fact-based historic interpretation was supposed to work, felt like that would be a good person as a neutral observer. And so I'd already involved him in things we were doing. And so he was open in a way to working with us because he already had on something unrelated to this bigger exhibit project.
Okay, so it's building relationships, recognizing that the state museum is an asset, a resource, figuring out how you could make more use of that resource than you had to date, and now bringing that to fruition.
Yeah.
Which I imagine is going to boost probably people being aware at the state capitol about that visit there may be traveling through your area and say, oh, I saw some of that stuff at the State Museum. I think I'd really like to see where it's all happening, and then they'll come and visit your park. Yeah, so
Well,
it all works.
Yeah, it's going to benefit both institutions and the people who, the Air Force veterans who've been donating stuff to the park for the better part of 20 years. They see it disappear into the vault. We can celebrate that what they gave us is important in as we continue on telling their story to the future.
Okay, great. Well, Eric's story here is shared with you a number of ideas about how to help you be resourceful and resilient, and I've shared some additional ideas with you as well. I'd like you to click off as many of these as you think would be valuable to you in helping to be more resilient by tapping your resources more effectively and successfully. So click off as many as are relevant for you. And while that's going on, Eric, I'm curious about how you have been able to move the Minuteman Park forward in a time of such constrained resources. What do you think have been some of the critical success factors in doing that? How have you been resilient at a time when other people are feeling very limited?
Well, we're in working with staff, we're defining limits and we're making some hard choices. We in the summer season in western South Dakota, by late June, it's light until 9 o'clock at night. We close the visitor center and the park down by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's us being responsible with the budgetary resources we have. We're communicating as the truth is most visitors don't actually know that they're coming here. They're on their way to somewhere else, be it Badlands, Mount Rushmore, Yellowstone, Glacier, and they literally pull off the highway and go, hey, what's that? And so for those visitors, you have to be very frank about what opportunities they can have as they're just driving past. For the planners, you have to say, if you want that tour of the control center, you have to have a reservation. And in the summer, those reservations usually are fully booked 2 months in advance, if not more. And so it's about making collaborative decisions and then communicating them as widely as possible, knowing you're not always going to reach everybody.
Okay. Well, I see that our audience is very strongly responding to the helpful suggestions that you were offering, Eric. So thanks so much for sharing your story and your illustration of things that are critical to helping be resilient in this environment. So what I want to do in the remainder of our time here, and again, if people have questions, send them in the question function. We just have about 5 minutes left here. But I want to look forward on resilience. You've been sharing stories about the past, and I'm wondering, maybe even start, Wendy, with an example of, you're in this cyclone bomb of a snowstorm. What are some things that you and your staff have done to be resilient in this time and be able to move forward the mission of the park?
During the storm, we just immediately were watching the weather, and everybody's brought their laptops, or most people who can have brought their laptops home or taken work home so that we're ready for tomorrow. Should we be closed, which it looks kind of likely that we will be. I think we're practicing resilience every day as we bounce back from the government shutdown, and we load balance what it is we're doing. We all sort of said we would do that as we came out of it, but I think the reality of it, as part of a grieving process, you sort of getting through it and then saying, okay, these are the things we really aren't going to get done this year, and letting those go is something we're working with right now so that we can be effective going forward for the rest of the year and on into next year.
Okay, good. And I'm wondering, what have you found helpful in you've each shared your own personal stories and also some about your staff, but I'm thinking in particular with the government shutdown, how have you helped your staff to be resilient, to bounce back from that, to go through that? Eric, do you have some thoughts you'd like to kick off with about helping uh, staff be resilient and not just yourself?
Listen, listen to their concerns, listen to their stories, and it never doubt the utility of the Serenity Prayer as a management tool, both personally and then as a group. Accept the things you cannot change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And I'm wondering, just to do a little cross-fertilization here between the two stories that you've shared, what are some things maybe that, Eric, you're picking up from what you heard from Wendy that you think might be helpful that you'd like to emphasize in going forward in your park? Were there things that bubbled up for you and you thought, as you listened to her, I'd really like to put that into practice for myself or for my park employees?
Well, the fact that we're both professional people and personal people, really speaks to me. I've come to the realization that everybody's work-life balance is sort of set separately, and once you figure out what that is, sort of respect it. And so I really appreciate that. And then just the idea of holding plans lightly, knowing that you forecasted we're going to do this, and reality may intervene.
Okay. All right. Good. Good. And I'm wondering, Wendy, as you're hearing some of the stories of resourcefulness that Eric is realizing at his location, are there things that are bubbling up in your mind about your situation as a result, or maybe the same things, or it's prompting a creative new idea from you about this? I'm interested in how parks and park superintendents can help support each other by sharing their stories and looking at what could be taken away from them.
I think anytime I hear somebody else's story of resourcefulness, there are nuggets in there that I go, oh, wow, we could have been a little more intentional about looking for that. And I know I want to have a conversation with Eric about how he got that maintenance facility exactly, and and how that all happened. Yeah. But I really like the clear way that the sort of the step by step that Eric laid out as a way of approaching change. I think that makes it less scary. If you can name something and put some steps with it, it becomes a lot less of a frightening black hole.
Okay. That's great. So we have a final polling question here, which is most importantly, we want to be sure that you, our audience, are getting value out of today's session. And we've been illustrating that with a very kind sharing from Wendy Davis and from Eric Leonard and the organizational efforts of Virginia Farley in putting this together. We'd love to see, how many things on this list have been relevant for you. Just tick off as many as are. And we will see the results here, and then I'll just turn to Wendy, Eric, and Virginia for their word of the day, if you will, a word or a short phrase, and we'll close out today's session once we see the polling results that have come through here. Okay, let's take a look at what we see. Wow, we see that people got a lot of value out of many different components of what was organized for today's session. So we're glad to have been of service to you. And with that, let's turn first, Wendy, a word or a phrase that you'd like to leave your audience with today?
Be a person who works, not a worker who is a person in your spare time. And be kind to each other.
Okay, thanks. Eric?
be aware of the power of whimsy, and don't take, at the end of the day, don't take ourselves or what we do too seriously.
All right. And Virginia, word from you.
Well, one thing that came through to me from the stories was that, grief and sadness are part of many processes that we go through organizationally and personally, and need to be processed, but there are resources, both inner and outer and organizational, that can be accessed, and people should really be encouraged to do that so they can move on and find some, balance.
Okay, great. Well, this is Don Maruska, and I'm so thankful for Wendy and Eric and Virginia, and for all of you who've joined us today, and for the very important work that you do in serving our parks. They're gems, and we appreciate all the things that you do under challenging circumstances to keep them shining as they do. So thank you so much, and you'll be getting further information about the resources that are available in a follow-up email. Everything is there you can access. This is a special website page that I set up for you, and everything there is free. I encourage you to take advantage of it. And we'll be getting the digital recording of today's session out there as well, so you can share with other people in your organization. So if you see somebody being down, you see that lizard brain taking over, say, hey, here's a resource. Take advantage of it. Let's pull together. We're going to make it through. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being so resilient, and thank you for your great work. Have a wonderful day.
Don. Thank you very much.
Stay dry in the snow.
And Eric and Wendy, you did a great job. Thanks so much for coming through on this and helping us out and really sharing. So very much appreciated.
It was fun.
Joy.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.